I'm Paul Jasa, Extension Engineer at the University of Nebraska. Dan contacted me months ago to speak on this meeting, and he just said he wanted me to talk about cover crops and no-till. I received a little pleasant surprise when I received the program itself said I'm just going to talk about increasing nitrogen efficiency. Well, to be truthful, I've not done a lot of work with nitrogen plots themselves as far as rates, efficiency, things like that, but I'm going to share some of the things I've learned when it comes to nitrogen management, when it comes to cover crops and no-till. And so with that in mind, this is a set of plots at the Rogers Memorial Farm. There's an obvious difference in growth here. These plots were planted the same day. That is the same variety, the same everything. This is 35 years no-till roughly. The obvious difference, the left versus the right. On the right side is corn into soybean residue. On the right side is corn on corn. And so when it comes to nitrogen efficiency, when it comes to growth, when it comes to whatever you want to call the difference here, crop rotation makes a huge difference. And Dan Snow showed some of that corn into soybeans was less of a problem when it comes to nitrogen management than corn on corn. Now, to be truthful on this one, it's even worse yet because the way these plots are managed. This researcher believes in applying the nitrogen closer to when the crop needs it. As such, his nitrogen goes on as side dress. This picture was taken only a couple of days after side dressing, and the corn on corn is definitely behind because it did not have enough nitrogen. And so again, the timing becomes very important when it comes to efficiency. Is the nitrogen there when the crop needs it? Dan Leininger showed a slide on nutrient uptake. And when it comes to nutrient uptake, again, we need a little bit of nitrogen early, we need a lot more later. And so side dressing is not a bad idea, but this set of research plots would definitely benefit from having a good, healthy starter nitrogen program applied. Now, the difference between the corn and the soybean residue, when Dan Leininger went over the UNL algorithm for nitrogen, there was a legume credit in there for the soybeans. We've got several of our researchers and extension people at UNL are starting to rename it. Not so much a legume credit, but a corn penalty when it comes to corn on corn. And that corn penalty is because of that extra carbon heavy residue that's out there. The microbes are using that as their food source. They need the nitrogen as food source to break down that carbon. And so the penalty is the fact that there's extra carbon residue out there. And that extra carbon residue, in a way, it's a bonus. It's going to sound odd, and it's because it gives you a timed release of the nitrogen. Because those microbes, once it breaks down the residue, they're going to release that nitrogen back into the system. The unfortunate thing is in this picture is early in the crop growth, it's still tied up. And we pay for nitrogen stabilizers. Well, this was a free one. We just have to learn to manage it by increasing the starter nitrogen for the corn on corn or corn into heavy carbon residues, whether it be wheat stubble, whether it be cover crops. Again, I'll talk a little bit about my experiences with that. Also, Dan wanted me to talk a little bit about tillage, reduced till. I'm a fan of no-till. I've got a set of tillage plots that were established the same time those previous plots were back in 1981. And again, there's the tilled on the left side and the no-till on the right side. I like the no-till when it comes to the residue protecting that soil surface, reduce evaporation. I like the no-till, that residue out there, like I say, is a time release for the nitrogen, especially if you surface apply nitrogen. Now, if you inject it below the residue, not as much is tied up. And so again, when it comes to nitrogen management, I prefer injected nitrogen. And a lot of the people who say you have problems with heavy residues tying up nitrogen, it is true it's tying it up because they're spraying the nitrogen on the residue. Inject it below the residue, it's going to minimize those problems. And those plots have been going since 1981. We've converted the entire Rogers Memorial Farm to no-till. And here's just an example where we're planting soybeans and this corn's planting down the old row. This is about 2 bushel corn residue, and there's a couple of visitors taking pictures. I had a lap, so I had to take a picture of them. But planting down the old row, a lot of people say, well, I can't do that. The corn root balls roll out. Yeah, there's 1 or 2 rolled out here, but not very many. And when I started looking at what's going on, it comes down to soil biology. And going to my long-term tillage plots, when I went out to do disking in the spring, I grabbed hold of a corn stalk, pulled up the corn stalk, went over the no-till, grabbed hold of the stalk, pulled one up, held them side by side, snapped the picture. When you look at these two, the one on the left is from the disc plot. The disking, it does tear up the residue, it does tear up the soil, but also tears up the soil biological life. It kills some of the good stuff that we want out there when it comes to cycling residue, when it comes to cycling the roots, when it comes to cycling the nutrients. On the right side, you can see the no-till one is basically rotted off from below because of all that biological activity. Well, that's good news when it comes to nutrient release from residue, when it comes to nutrient release from those roots, because the soil biology put that back into the soil system where the new crop can take it up. And we get a lot of farmers that say, well, I've thought about no-till, but the residue just builds up. They haven't been doing no-till long enough to get the soil biology working for them. And it's the soil biology that's going to cycle the residue. It's going to cycle the nutrients as well. And again, that previous field I showed where we're planting, this is a few weeks later. You can see the soybeans are coming up nicely. You can see a lot of the residues disappearing. The planter knocked it over and got it down in contact with the soil. Now the soil microbes are breaking down that residue. Well, that's exactly when I want it to be broke down, is when the next crop is growing, such that the next crop can take the carbon dioxide that's put off by the residue. It can take the nutrients released from the residue. I don't want that residue to break down, say, the fall before, because I did fall tillage. When it comes to more effective and efficient use of those nutrients, do it when the next crop is growing. Now, my long-term tillage plots had started in 1981, had 6 different tillage systems there. No-till on top. The no-till with C means with row crop cultivation. And then single disc, double disc, chisel with 1 disking, fall chisel with 1 disking in the spring, fall plow, 2 diskings in the spring. And here's a 3-year average on yields there. And we'll look at that. Row crop cultivation cost me 9 bushels. In the corn, cost me almost 2 bushels in soybeans. Again, it's not when I want to stir the soil in dry land conditions in particular, because that's when I need that soil moisture. I need the mulch on top to reduce evaporation. Even in irrigated conditions, I don't want to stir the soil then, because I'm going to disturb the soil biology. Again, the soil biology is what's cycling the residue nutrients for me. Now, the reason I broke that at 2007, I started thinking about, this has been no-till since 1981. I'm past 25 years of no-till. Why aren't there bigger differences? Started thinking about it, and started doing some extra exploration. And Dan talked about taking vadose zone samples down to 60 feet. I'm not quite that ambitious. We went down to 6 feet to look at carbon in the soil. And when it comes to that upper layer, 0 to 4 inches, the light blue bar there is no-till. The purple bar sort of is the plow system. Red is the chisel, and sort of the yellow is the disc. There was a lot more carbon near the soil surface with the no-till, and a lot of people expect that because all the residue is right on top. When I looked at the deeper depths, the ones that surprised me most was that 18 to 32 inch depth. That's way below the tillage zone. It's not getting the carbon down there because I'm mixing it in there with tillage. In fact, the no-till is the highest down there. And that's because we got better roots down there, more roots. It's the root exudates that are going to be putting carbon into the soil profile. A lot of people think it's the biomass on top. No, biomass on top, when it breaks down, some of the carbon goes in the soil, some of it goes off as carbon dioxide, but it's the root exudates are building a lot more of the soil carbon. Well, the soil carbon itself, 62% carbon in organic matter. And so with this much more carbon increase in organic matter showing up. And again, as Dan Leininger pointed out, that increase in organic matter gives us better efficiency when it comes to our nitrogen management, because we can mineralize some of that organic matter and provide some nitrogen to the crop. So again, anything I do to build organic matter is going to help on my nitrogen management. Well, when I started thinking about how can I improve that soil health, yes, I've been no-tilling. And there's a list of things out there that a lot of people have. The main 5 when it comes to soil health or conservation agriculture is minimal soil disturbance. That's what my no-till is. Keep the soil covered with residue on top. That's what my no-till is. Diversity of plants. Well, wait a minute. I'm in a corn soybean rotation. Well, rotation isn't correct. It's oscillation. When you're going just back and forth, corn, soybeans, that's oscillation. Rotation is going to be 3 or more things when it comes to diversity. What I was missing though was living roots in the soil as close to year round as possible. Because again, it's those living roots that give off those carbon exudates in the soil to feed the soil biology. And it's the soil biology that's going to take that chunk of uh, rock phosphorus, for instance, and break it down into a soluble form that the roots can take up. It's going to do that for our decaying residues. It's the soil biology is what we need to feed. That's where the living roots come in place. Now, integrate livestock, there's a lot of producers say that's going to help a lot as well. The trampling of the residue, the slobbering of the livestock, the microbes from the ruminants in particular are going to help break down residues, help feed that system. My research plots, Rogers Memorial Farm, we don't have livestock, so I don't quite have that one. But again, when you talk to producers who've integrated livestock, they start seeing some more changes yet. So again, when it comes to getting the roots closer to year round, I looked at cover crops. And when we started exploring cover crops back about 2000, there's a whole bunch of cover crop seeds out there, put the question mark on there, which one do you plant? Well, it comes down to what are you trying to accomplish? On top of that list is erosion control. That's where NRCS and a lot of NRDs are helping fund cover crops to reduce erosion. General Q public wants reduced erosion, wants reduced soil sediment, nutrients washing off our land. So erosion control becomes important. Next one there, nutrient capture, nutrient cycling. That's where we see a lot of it in Nebraska in our seed corn production areas where seed corn is typically over-fertilized, over-watered because it is a high-value crop. Well, a lot of people are putting a cover crop in there to capture those extra nutrients there, grow it in a biological form, such the off-season precip doesn't leach it down through the soil profile. And again, when it comes to things that Dan Snow talked about in that nitrate moving through the soil profile, that's where the cover crop has an advantage by holding it in a biological form. And again, I say it's a sequestered nitrogen. It is a time release. When that residue breaks down next year, you're gonna get that nitrogen back from those microbes working for you. With that, we're gonna improve the soil health. And that's what I would really wanna do with my cover crops. Erosion control is not near as high on my list, and nutrient cycling not near as much for me when it comes to dryland production, but the soil health is what I'm after. There's other things on the list. Those other things are, that's a separate hour-long presentation if I was going to talk about all those. But again, we got to think about it. I put forage or grazing on the bottom of my list because at that point, it's a forage crop or a grazing crop. It's not a cover crop to feed the soil system. And again, when it comes to erosion control, here's an example from a producer in Northeast Nebraska. Back in 2007, he had a nice cover crop there. It sprayed out and he planted his corn. 5-inch rain, and that's about a 10% slope in soil. Very little soil movement. They're there in the bottom center. You can see a little bit of concentrated flow, but didn't wash out the crop, didn't make a big gully. Again, that's where a lot of our natural resource districts and the NRCS has been doing some cost share. And in fact, our Nebraska NRCS even has cost share program on concentrated flow areas. You know, here we just reshaped the gully, then one single pass of the drill, put a cover crop in there. And again, that's going to help when it comes to the erosion control. Now, when it comes to nitrogen management, the rest of the field is still the same. So we can't do much difference there. But what I'm after, and I thank Ralph Dirks, a friend of mine from No-Till Consultant in South America. This is some South American soil where they have cover crops basically on every acre across a lot of Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina. And it's because they get more rainfall, they're closer to the equator, they have a longer growing season, but again, they're really feeding that soil biology. And you can really see improved soil structure there. The organic matter comes up, all the benefits that we like to see in cover crops. And so when I started thinking about how do I increase biological diversity in my system, some producers putting wheat back into the rotation. People say, well, I can't make money with wheat compared to corn and soybeans. Well, I've got some producers who are putting wheat back in the rotation, then putting a short season forage in after the wheat. Now, rather than growing one crop of wheat a year, I'm growing one crop of wheat, maybe a half a crop of forage. And that's going to make more money than a single crop of corn or a single crop of soybeans. And so again, we got to start thinking about biological diversity. I'm going to use the cover crops to get my biological diversity. And so my long-term tillage plots were corn and soybeans in 2005 on beyond. I showed that yield data earlier. And again, this is where I put cereal rye in. Cereal rye is a cool season grass. Corn, soybeans are both warm season crops, the grass and a legume. So I got 3 crop types there. I'm starting to get increased diversity. And so that growing some extra residue there, but more important, growing some extra carbon and having that living root putting carbon into the soil. So then did that about 2007. I started the cover crops. Here's the next 4 years. No-till 216 corn. My corn's coming up. No-till with cover crop 204. I had a lot of friends say, well, why are you using the cover crop? You gave up a lot of yield. Look down below at all the tillage. Why are you using tillage? You gave up a lot of yield. And so again, we got to start thinking about what we're doing in the system. Max yield, well, maybe I'm after that, maybe not, but I'm after a better soil system. The no-till has reduced erosion. It has good yields. So again, we got to start thinking about it. But one of the things when I started to analyze compared to other states or other regions right here about cover crops, my cover crop, I was spraying out early. This is cereal rye about the time I'm going out to kill it. Here in dry land, southeast Nebraska, I'm really worried about the cover crop using too much soil moisture. And so I says, I'm not going to let it get real big. I'm going to kill it early. I'm going to have the living root there in the off season. I'm going to get that benefit, but I'm not going to get a lot of biomass produced there. And there's too many people who are hung up on yield, hung up on biomass. They're not looking at what's actually happened in the soil system. And I say I contrast that to David Brandt over in Ohio. David's been featured in a lot of cover crop articles. He's been using cover crops. He's been doing no-till over 40 years, using cover crops over 35 years. And he has really put in a lot of carbon back into the system because having that growing year round. He's got a lot of biomass produced there. And David used to think cereal rye was the way to go. He is now looking at a diverse cover crop of having several mixed species there and getting even better results. But again, cereal rye grows that tall is going to use a lot of water. That's not me. That's how I'm killing mine early. But again, I started thinking more about it, the proper crop rotation. On top there has got cool season grass, wheat, got cool season broadleaf being field peas. On the bottom, got cool season or warm season grass, corn, warm season legume, soybeans. Again, if I can get all 4 crop types in the mix, it's going to be more diversity. I can even put more things in there, some pollinators, some flowering things to help feed the bees. So again, start thinking about diversity and rotation of the crops. And so again, when it came to my long-term tillage plots, they were corn and soybeans, both warm season. My cover crop, I switched it from cereal rye to a mix of cereal rye and Austrian winter peas, both cool season, but now I got a legume and a grass there. Give me some nitrogen fixation perhaps from the legume, but more important, give me some biological diversity. This is what it'll look like in the fall coming up. Peas, cutes, and little tendrils. This is what it'll look like in the spring coming out of dormancy. You can see a little damage of the frost on the cereal rye, and you can see, damn, the pea died. That was expensive seed. Well, peas are a little bit different than soybeans. Soybeans push the seed up out of the ground, that's cotyledons. Peas leave the seed in the ground. A surface seeded pea will die every year in the winter here in Nebraska, but seed it deep. And this is one I dug up, sitting on my hand. It was planted about 2.5 inches deep. You can see on the top there where it's frosted off, but you can see every node below the ground is sending up a sprout. That single pea seed is sending up 3 in this example here. And that's going to be the key to get my Austrian winter peas to survive the winter, is plant them deeper. A lot of people say peas don't work in Nebraska. I've been using them since 2005, but I've learned to plant them deep to make them survive. And that little pea right there, this is what the root system looked like. That is just breaking dormancy in April. Look at the nodules there already. When it comes to nitrogen management, that's fixing some nitrogen for me so I don't have to apply as much. I don't know what the legume credit will be. You know, we got plenty of research out there on soybeans being 45 pounds. Will the peas be that? Well, some years maybe not. Well, so 2012 I actually changed my cover crop to the pea cereal rye mix. Here's in 2015, I look corn 223, corn with cover 207. Oops, didn't help me much. Wait, still beat the tillage. So again, why are you doing the tillage? But here's something I started to notice. This is split down the middle there. On the right side is the fall chiseled corn stalks. The day I went out to do my spring disking, I had to snap this picture. Corn residue is still there. A lot of people say, well, you got to chisel the stalks, got to disc them, you got to get rid of the residue. On the left side of the picture is no-till with cover crop drilled into it. And this is in early April. The cover crop hasn't quite broke dormancy yet. You can just barely see the rows of green there. That's the Austrian winter pea cereal rye mix. But again, which one has soil biology that's cycling the residue? And this is one that throws a lot of producers off when they say, I've got too much residue out there. I tell them, plant a cover crop. And they say, oh, that'll grow more residue. I go, no, that'll feed the soil biology so that you can cycle the residue, such that the nutrients that are tied up in that residue will be released into the soil system. And so again, that's where I'm looking at cover crops now to feed that soil system to help the cycle the nutrients to be more efficient. And again, this is only after a couple of years of stepping up that soil biology. 2018 was a pretty good corn year. Again, this is dryland, southeast Nebraska. And my no-till 224, no-till with cover crop, 232. Now I picked up 8 bushels because of that cover crop. Now I'm starting to feed that soil biology and it's starting to become a more responsive system. I have not cut back my nitrogen application. We fertilized for 200 bushel of corn and put on 170 pounds of N and that soybean residue. I'm raising some reasonable corn there, even in the tillage systems there. Well, the tillage does oxidize and release nutrients from the residue. It's helping us with mineralization. So again, I'm burning up my residue there for the sake of growing the crop. The no-till, I'm building organic matter, building the crop. And my organic matters in the tills, when I started the project in 1981, were around 2.2 across the entire field. Organic matter in the till is still around 2.2 to 2.5. Organic matter in the no-till is about 3.2 to 3.5. Organic matter in my long-term no-till with cover crops, when I put wheat in the rotation, I've gotten it up to about 5.2. And so again, building that organic matter is going to cycle more nutrients. It's going to let more be released from the organic matter. It's going to help me on nutrient uptake. And again, we're applying 170 pounds of N for a 200 bushel yield goal with our corn bean rotation. Now, I said corn bean is actually an oscillation going back and forth. It's not a rotation. A rotation, the one we use at the Rogers Memorial Farm on some of the acres, is corn, beans, wheat. Now I got 3 things. Now I'm actually rotating. And so I started thinking about, all right, let's look at corn, beans, wheat. We got 2 grasses, 1 legume, 2 warm season, 1 cool season. Let's look at what happens when we start putting cover crops into a rotation as well. And so I went out there, and after corn harvest, I drilled Austrian winter peas. I said I like those because they can fix some N. It's going to give me an extra legume. So I'll have the corn and wheat as grasses, but I'm going to also have the Austrian winter peas, soybeans as legumes. And after wheat harvest, I'm going to plant soybeans as a cover crop, so I get another legume yet. So here I am planting Austrian winter peas. And across the years, I started this project 2005. That's where I learned to plant them deeper. When I had it mixed with cereal rye on my tillage plots, I planted only about 2.5 inches deep. We plant all our cover crops at least 2.5 inches deep. 2.5 inches deep is because I wanted the rye to come up. The Austrian winter peas by themselves, I'll plant them 4 inches deep. And here it is, and this is actually in mid-March, Austrian winter peas coming up. You can see how much the corn residue disappeared. This is the same field. A lot of those corn residues disappeared because of improved soil biology. And those peas, when they look like this mid-March, by mid-April, they're up there flowering already. They fixed 100 pounds of N. I can get real excited about that in a warm spring where they take off early. I said I plant them deeper. There's the backside of my Hy-Vee fuel saver card. It's not a credit card. Don't bother copying down the number. But that's just for reference there. You can see the frosted off top. Let me move my pointer over there. This is ground level. That frosted off top at ground level, these were just starting to peek out of the ground. The shoots that were coming up from every node that was below ground. You can see the seed down there on the bottom. And again, that one single seed, in this case, it's going to put up at least 3, if not 4 shoots above ground. Again, when it comes to the nodules working for me, here's a couple weeks later, and again, the frosted off top, about right there and about right there. You can see how much now is coming above ground, but look how many nodules are there. And again, in a warm spring, that might give me 100 pounds in. In a cool spring, here it is, the day I was going out getting ready to spray down herbicide. That's all the growth I had on my peas. The peas at this stage might have gave me 5 pounds in. Who knows for sure? And that's one of the problems when it comes to nitrogen management. How much does a legume fix for us as a cover crop? What is the growth going to be like? Especially in a corn bean rotation where it doesn't have much growth at all in the fall. And in the spring, it depends on what the weather is and when are you going to terminate the cover crop. So again, we got to start thinking about our nitrogen management. But I have fed the soil biology. I'm cycling my residue. I'm getting improved nutrient management from what is there in the field itself because of the better soil biology. And again, when it comes to that better soil biology, Austrian winter peas I used as an extra legume. I used cereal rye as an extra carbon source. And this is, again, the dividing line. The left side is where the cereal rye is just breaking dormancy. You can see how much less residue is there compared to the right side. The right side is the corn, bean, wheat rotation with no cover crops since 2005. The residue is still there because the soil biology is not near as high, even though it's no-till with a good crop rotation. I upped the soil biology on the left side because I got the cereal rye after the corn, and after wheat, I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button. After wheat, I plant, again, a legume versus a carbon cover crop. The legume cover crop there is just common soybeans. It's the leftover soybean seed we have from the spring. On the taller stuff there, that's bin run grain sorghum, a carbon cover crop. Now, a lot of people complain about the price of cover crop seed. Bin run grain sorghum seeded at 5 to 10 pounds per acre. Grain sorghum sells for $3 to $5 a bushel, depending upon the year, $6 right now. When you think about that seeding rate, that's about 50 cents an acre cover crop seed cost for that grain sorghum. Now, yes, it cost me to run the drill. But again, here's extra carbon going in the system from both of them and the root exudates, extra carbon biomass with the grain sorghum residue, extra legume with some nitrogen from the soybeans. So again, this has been going since 2005. And I like this as cover crop after wheat because wheat comes off early. I've got more time to grow something in the summertime, harvesting that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sunlight. Those two cannot be stored unless we grow something. And so again, that's where putting wheat back in rotation helps me to grow something to feed the soil system. And here's something I learned. This is a picture actually from 2020. There's the grain sorghum on the left. The next strip is no cover crop. You see the weeds there. Then there's soybeans on the far right there. After the wheat was harvested, we sprayed 2,4-D Roundup to kill everything that was out there. These are weeds that came up after the cover crop was seeded. You don't see those weeds where the grain sorghum is. The weed control there helps because something is growing. Mother Nature is an opportunist. If you're not growing something, Mother Nature will. And those are called weeds. Any bare spot in your lawn, your field, you'll see that. Again, by growing something, having a cover there, I'm reducing weed pressures. And so again, it may not contribute to yield, but it's going to reduce costs on further herbicide application. The beauty of grain, sorghum, and soybeans is my cover crops in wheat stubble. They both frost kill, no extra herbicide. And when you look at that frost kill there, then, yes, I got some extra carbon biomass. Yes, I got some extra nitrogen fixation there from the soybeans. What's it worth? 2008. Remember, this project started 2005. This is after cycling through the rotation of corn, beans, wheat once. Wheat stubble with no cover crop. I planted the corn, had 166 bushel corn. Where I had the mono cover crop, the extra carbon, 175. Where I had the soybeans with extra nitrogen, 179. That yield increase there can make up for the lack of money you may make on wheat. A lot of farmers say you can't make money on wheat. Well, if I can add an extra 10, 15 bushels to my corn, that'll make up for the lack of yield on wheat compared to what you can make on corn. So again, we start thinking about diversity, start feeding about the soil system. Here's the surprise to me though, the next spring. That's the grain sorghum residue on the right. On the left was a strip with no cover crop. That grain sorghum residue there suppressed the volunteer wheat. Again, when it comes to saving money, we didn't have to do a burn down where we have a cover crop. Now, where these plots were, I had to do it anyway because plots are only 15 feet wide. But again, when it comes to the cover crops, feeding the soil system, suppressing the weeds, cycling nutrients, there's a lot of pluses there. One extra plus just sort of hiding here. You can see a little bit of torn up wheat there. On the grain sorghum side, you can hardly see any soil disturbance. And hydrous applicator already went through this field getting ready to plant corn. We get better soil structure, better soil stability there by having the cover crop there and the cover crop roots there, and a better soil life, soil biology. So again, I like the cover crops. Okay, a lot of people say, well, cover crops are going to cost you. 2012 was a drought year. 2012, we had some corn, not much rainfall that year. There's a lot of our neighbors had zero corn. They did tillage, or no till. No cover crop 76 with carbon cover crop 76, nitrogen cover crop 74. Down a little bit. 2013, the year after, carbon cover crop up, nitrogen cover crop up a little bit more. And again, it's because of the extra residue there. Now, this is back when we were fertilizing about 140 pounds of N into soybean residue. We are putting that on our corn residue as well, and our wheat residue. We have very little corn on corn. We have a little bit of corn into wheat. And we said we got to change our nitrogen management some. Our yields are going up. And so by 2015, we started putting 170 pounds in on our bean residue, 200 pounds on our wheat residue. Look at the 2015 yield. 197, well, 200 pounds in, that's about a pound per bushel. The carbon cover crop, still about a pound per bushel. The nitrogen, look, I picked up 10, 15 bushel, depending on which we were comparing it to there. There's some nitrogen being fixed by that cover crop in that wheat stubble. Again, that yield increase there paid for that cover crop easily and reduced my nitrogen load, and my nutrients are being released later when the crop was growing. I can love that. We say we put on 200 pounds on our wheat stubble. We usually put 170 on our bean stubble. Well, then next year, the farm manager forgot. And on my wheat stubble for this plot, he put down only 170 pounds in. Where the carbon cover crop was, it raised 178 bushel corn. That's better than a pound per bushel, or bushel per pound, sorry. And again, I felt pretty good about that until I looked at the other two numbers. Long-term no-till wheat stubble, corn, bean, wheat rotation, 195. Picked up 4 more bushel by having that nitrogen cover crop there, 199. So again, that was, remember my opening slide, I showed corn residue penalty because of the carbon for corn on corn. The penalty's not there with the legume credit. That's what it comes down to when it comes to our high carbon cover crops. It is a penalty because the microbes are taking that nitrogen and holding it to break down that residue. It'll be released later. But if you're giving up yield because of poor growth early and poor yield potential being set at that V6 stage when the corn plant is putting a number of kernels around an ear or number of rows around an ear, it's going to cost you in yield. And that's where we like a little bit of more starter nitrogen for the high carbon cover crops. How much nitrogen can you expect? This is a view from Google Earth of a plot area there. This is 10 acres total. Each of those plots, you can see strips there about a quarter acre in size, because there's 42 plots actually across those 10 acres. I planted 8 different cover crops to see how much nitrogen they would fix. This is into wheat stubble. The strips there that you don't see any green in, that is the wheat stubble with no cover crop, because I did a nitrogen rate study as well. I put down 5 different rates of nitrogen. And then what you can do is you can draw a nitrogen rate response curve. And when I did that, 2012 was that drought year. I seeded my cover crops 2011. I didn't know the drought was coming. But in 2012, I put down 0 pounds of nitrogen, 40, 80, 120, and 200 pounds in. And you can see the blue dots there. Those are the 3 reps. The nitrogen rate response curve there fits fairly well. Richard Ferguson, a nitrogen specialist here at the university, accused me of fudging the data to get it fit that well, but that's actually the way it worked. The 89 there is the 80-pound rate of nitrogen from anhydrous or I'm sorry, of liquid UAN solution here, because that's how I could vary the rates easier. The UAN solution there was injected into the ground. It's not applied on the soil surface. With the 80-pound rate there gave me 89 bushel corn where there was no cover crop. And I say that number because I didn't think a cover crop can grow all year in. So I put down an 80-pound rate across all the cover crops. And so that's going to be your reference there, 89 bushel corn. Well, here's my 8 cover crops. There are 3 that took it over 100 bushels. There are 5 that are pretty close at 89. Well, some people say, all right, well, how much nitrogen did you fix with the cover crops? I'll call this apparent nitrogen. I don't know if it's had so much fixed, but I call it apparent because if you take this 89 bushel and you go up to the new yield of the cover crop, come across the line here, and where it hits this line, and it just barely touches the line here, when I look down on the axis itself, from there, going back to the 80 pounds, in 2012, a drought year, that cover crop, the good ones there, was worth apparently the same as 60 more pounds of nitrogen. 60 pounds of nitrogen sounds nice. If I can reduce my purchased nitrogen and have that 60 pounds being time released from my cover crop residues decomposing. So again, then when it comes to nitrogen management, that's where I can get excited about a legume cover crop. Now it turns out in a drought year, 80 pounds N was probably the most economical rate anyway. I can definitely tell you going up here to the 200 pounds N did not make me any money. So again, people will say, all right, what was the cover crops there? What fixed you the most nitrogen? Here's where I got a little bit of a surprise. My winning yield there was CRI. Wait a minute, that's not a legume, that's not a nitrogen fixer. Again, it turns out the 80 pounds N was enough in the drought year. What the cereal rye did is gave me more residue, but more importantly, it gave me a biological life, biological activity in the off season to feed the soil biology such that I can cycle the residual nutrients from the wheat and the wheat residue more efficiently. So again, that's where feeding soil biology is important. Chickling vetch, that is a cool season, spring planted typical legume. Chickling vetch was bred in Saskatchewan, germinates at 35 degrees soil temperature. There's a lot of organic producers will plant that in March, let it grow. There's a variety out there called AC Green Fix that if you let it grow, they say for 10 weeks, it can fix 100 pounds of N. There are some dryland organic producers who use that to grow their N before planting corn or milo in April or May. So again, it's a nice nitrogen fixer. Now I planted in the heat of the summer, it might have done better. Austrian winter peas grew over the winter, fixed quite a bit in. Those are my 3 winners for cover crops, but only 2 of them were N fixers. So again, we got to look at some interactions there. Well, corn, bean, wheat rotation on this field, that was 2012. 2014, I planted cover crops for 2015 corn. And here's the dividing line, for instance, between soybeans on the right side. Soybeans we know fix in. On the left side is that chickling vetch. And you look at that and say, huh? Doesn't look like much. Some people call it grassy pea vine. It is a legume that does look a little bit like a grass when it comes to the leaves. And so again, I put that out again in 2014 for the 15 corn crop. I did the nitrogen rate study. And this time, it looked like we're going to have a better year. I put on more nitrogen, and my steps there were 0, 60 pounds, 130 pounds. I had some calibration problems there. I didn't quite get uniform steps. 190 pounds, and that last one really pushed it 320 pounds. There's a nitrogen rate response curve when it comes to the 3 dots of 3 reps. Again, they're damn close. These are the same strips in the same location as the 2012 year, but in 13 was soybeans, 14 was wheat, 15 was back to corn. 201 was my base rate, again, my middle rate there, and that was the 130 pound nitrogen. 79 was the yield with 0 applied nitrogen. And so now when I look at my covers, again, a couple of them didn't do so good. But when you take this top one, slide across, slide down, turns out it was about a 60-pound end credit. That's after wheat, so it had 3-4 months to grow. Over here is a hidden dot. That is, I put a cocktail of nitrogen fixing plants in with no applied nitrogen. And again, I even take that one and come across and down. Again, it's about 60 pounds in. And so again, when it comes to dryland production, southeast Nebraska on our silted clay loam soil, it's about a 3% organic matter, 4% perhaps. Corn, bean, wheat rotation, I can get 60 pounds in fixed there. The important news is if I continually do that, I put on 60 pounds less purchased in. So again, we got to think about that. All right, what's the winner on top there? Checkling vetch. Remember, it didn't look like much. Here's what it looked like that next spring. Frost knocked it down. Stu Hoff, our farm manager, is standing up here to take a look at it. There's a lot of biomass there. More important, there's a lot of nitrogen fixation there. And the nitrogen fixation, remember 201 was the reference, 225. Now, when I started thinking about those 60 pounds in, I picked up 24 bushel of corn. That's doing pretty good. Down there at the bottom, that 79 with no N became 139. Again, when it comes to nitrogen efficiency, right there, 0 applied in, and I picked up 70 bushels. So again, we got to start thinking about, are we looking at efficiency? Are we looking at use? Are we looking at maximum economic return? I look at nitrogen management and try to minimize risk to the environment. If I can grow excess nitrogen into a biological form that's released later, that saves me the money on a something applied to nitrogen to make it hang around longer, because that's what we're doing there. So with that in mind, we like cover crops after our wheat harvest. This is already seeded to a cover crop. My grain drill leaves all the residue standing. That's what it looks like a little bit later coming up. I use a broad cocktail mix. There's some flowers in there to keep bees happy. There's some grasses in there to grow some carbon, and there's some legumes in there to fix some nitrogen. When I have the legumes in there, the carbon penalty goes away. I don't have to apply extra starter nitrogen. Here's a little later in the season. People say, well, it looks like good for grazing. And again, when it comes to putting wheat back in the rotation, if I'm a cattleman, maybe that's going to give me some extra grazing opportunity to give pasture and rangeland a rest. When it comes to nitrogen management, I'm going to be growing some of my own here, give pasture and rangeland a rest, and again, make that more efficient. So again, we got to think about total farming system. Grazing itself, like I say, I don't do that at the Rogers Memorial Farm. There's a lot of no-tillers who are using cover crops who will do that. But when it comes to grazing, it's a little different now. Rather than feeding the livestock or feeding the soil system like I am, you're feeding the livestock. And to get a high quality feed, this is a set of plots I put out every year where I have different mixes there. And that goes from the lower right to the upper left is the diagonal there. You notice there's a diagonal going the other direction there from the right or left side to the right that's a darker green. I put out a no nitrogen on the cover crop, but I put on 50 pounds of nitrogen on my cover crop there. Now the 50 pounds will be recovered easily when that residue breaks down, but more importantly, it's going to grow extra biomass now for grazing purposes. Now it's darker green there. Here it is about a month later, now looking straight down the line. Where that pink flag is, to the right is the 50 pounds N, to the left is no extra N. Again, to feed the soil system, I don't need extra N. To feed the livestock, look how much more biomass I grow there by just putting on a little bit of nitrogen. So again, when it comes to nitrogen management, that isn't going to get lost in the environment because I'm growing it into a biological form. And that's what a cover crop is doing on both sides there. I'm going to feed more livestock if I put a little fertilizer on my cover crop. So again, we got to think about the nitrogen management across the entire system. The cover crops I use is that mix I showed earlier, all frost kills. This was cover crop on wheat stubble. Here I'm out there planting into that wheat stubble. And you'll notice there are no weeds there. There's no volunteer wheat. Again, I said that earlier, we've eliminated our volunteer wheat by having a cover crop out there. We've actually helped a lot on weed control, having the cover crop out there. We're helping on the nutrient cycling. So again, we got to start thinking about the total system. We got some people talking about planting green into cover crops. A friend of mine here planting into heavy cover crop residue here, planting green. Notice the extra weights across the back of his air seeder, the yellow and red weights there to make sure he cuts down through the cover crop residue, cuts down in the soil. But again, this is a grass cover crop here, a winter annual, that's going to tie up some nitrogen. Well, he's blowing on some extra nitrogen as well. He's got double tubes there where you can get some extra fertilizer out there. So we got to think about that. Or this producer down in Kansas, again, he's got a cover crop he seeded after wheat harvest, a lot more carbon biomass there. Well, he wanted it as a mulch to reduce evaporation. You can see some nitrogen in his tank there, putting down a little bit of nitrogen. He's actually seeding grain sorghum here into this in a region of Kansas where a lot of grain sorghum's grown. The little extra starter nitrogen there, and then he puts the rest of his nitrogen on differently. So again, boost that starter. And when it comes to that carbon penalty I mentioned earlier for corn on corn, this is a center of 6 rows of a plot. The 2 rows on the right look darker green, nicer. The 4 rows, the 2 rows on the left. The 4 rows center and to the right look a little puny. This is planted the same day, the same planter pass. This is with just 1034 starter, no extra nitrogen. The difference on the 2 rows on the left side is this researcher had brought in a little forage harvester and cut off some of the cover crop there, trying to determine how much biomass he had produced. You can see there's less residue on those 2 rows. On the right side, there's more residue there. So again, removing some of the residue removes some of the carbon penalty. Well, I'd rather up the starter nitrogen and leave the carbon there. Here's a cover crop already planted to corn. That cover crop is just ready to be sprayed out. We're terminating this one at planting time. It rained on us. You can see where the Packer press wheels marks got rained in. And fortunately, we got out there and got it sprayed before the corn came up. But again, that cover crop growing there, a nitrogen penalty because this is cereal rye, it used some nitrogen out of the soil profile. And here it is. Oops, let me back up one. This strip, and then there's a second strip here, another rep over here with 2 different treatments in between. Now I go forward. There's the first strip we're looking down, 2 reps in between, and then here's that second strip we're looking at. You can see again that carbon penalty because that early season cover crop tied up some nitrogen as it was growing. It was released later in the season, the corn caught up, and there was actually no difference in yield. So I was actually pleased with this one, but I don't like planting into a cover crop that's using nitrogen at the same time I want my corn to be using the nitrogen. So we typically like to terminate our cover crops a couple weeks ahead of time. Here's Keith Gluen walking along behind the planter looking at planting into this cover crop. Here's Dale Flowerday, who's passed away recently, but Dale's standing there looking at where's all that cover crop residue? Where's all that corn residue? This is irrigated corn on corn. That cover crop step up soil biology to cycle things. And that's what I'm after is I feed that system, make it more efficient. Closing thought on that, here's a set of plots we had up at the Mead, the research farm there. The first 10 feet of the plot here was no cover crop. That is white of soybean residue. The next 10 feet was a cover crop that sprayed out a month before planting. The next 10 feet sprayed out 2 weeks before planting. The next 10 feet sprayed out the day of planting. And the last 10 feet, residue was removed the day of planting. When you look down the row, this was a carbon cover crop. We used triticale on one set of plots, cereal rye on another, and wheat on another. When you look down the row, the corn looks fine. There's no carbon penalty. Well, what's hiding here is, look at this mark right here. We had starter nitrogen close to the row. And that's how you overcome that carbon penalty, is making sure there's nitrogen close to the row to feed that young crop such that the residue doesn't tie it up. Now, you don't add extra nitrogen, you just change the timing of some of the nitrogen. Like say 50 pounds extra starter nitrogen, decrease your broadcast application or knife application or whatever by those 50 pounds. Your total nitrogen is the same and you eliminate that cover crop penalty and can still use that carbon cover crop. Again, some people say, well, remove the residue, remove the carbon penalty. It removes the carbon as well. And as that carbon goes away, so does phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and a lot of other nutrients. And every one of those 1,000-pound bales is about $20 worth of fertilizer. So again, I like to leave the residue in place. One last thought is we do have a researcher, Humberto Blanco, is looking at, for people who do harvest residue, can you grow some carbon back by growing a cover crop? And you'll see little 30-foot by 30-foot plots here where he has gone in and removed residue at different levels, 25, 50, 75, or 100% of the residue. And he's growing cover crop there with cereal rye to see if you can grow it back. And again, if you need to harvest some residue, maybe you grow some carbon back. And when he's trying to grow that carbon back, he's terminating the cover crop 2 weeks, 3 weeks ahead of planting or the day of planting. He finds out that if you're removing more than 50% of the residue, you're still going to be carbon negative on the system. You can't grow enough with cereal rye in dryland Nebraska. So again, we got to start thinking about the total system there. Close on just, we got to manage the total system. You know, here's someone set up. You can apply liquid fertilizer. You can apply seed. You can apply anhydrous. But again, when we start thinking about total system, manage it across the year, manage it across the rotation, manage it such that I'm going to feed the soil biology. With that, I'm up to 11 o'clock when this is supposed to adjourn. I will hang on if there are any questions there. I had a few more pictures, but I always put a stopping point in.
Paul, I just had a question. What's the biggest mistake you see producers make when they go from conventional to no-till?
When it comes to, I'm not muted. When it comes to switching from conventional to no-till, the early research said you're going to have to put on a lot more nitrogen because those microbes are being tying up the nitrogen that you have there, and you're going to have a nitrogen deficiency. That was true back in the 60s where people went from plowing to no-till, went from no residue to residue. So the extra nitrogen is not needed. The biggest mistake I see, though, is usually in weed control or in the fact that they think that parking the tillage tool is all you have to do. You do have to change your management. I'm going to boost my starter nitrogen, but cut back on total nitrogen. Especially the longer you go, the more soil biology works for you. But weed control is one place. But the biggest mistake I probably see is people didn't plan ahead, didn't spread the residue to harvest before, or they didn't set the planter heavy enough to penetrate through untilled soil and through that residue. And so they end up seeding the crop too shallow. They need to make sure there's enough weight on that planter to cut down through that residue and make sure that residue is properly spread before.